Those people who wrote those hymns knew what they were doing. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Romans chapter 12. This is where we'll spend our time again today. Paul has been taking us on a journey which is continuing, but the journey has shifted a bit. It started out explaining to us the mechanics of salvation, the lostness of humanity and what God was going to do about that. He then moved into what it is within the believing community, how then shall we live? And now he's going to move out just a bit and have us encounter the non-believing community. So let's see what this would teach us today. I'll begin reading in chapter 12, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with everyone. Don't be proud. Be willing to associate with people of low position. Don't be conceited. Don't repay evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And if it is possible, as far as it depends on us, live at peace with everyone. Don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I, the Lord, will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed them. If the enemy is thirsty, give your enemy something to drink. And in doing this, you will heap burning coals on the head of your enemy. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Wow. Well, we're done. Let's close in prayer. I mean, that's a high calling, is it not? And I would say, for me, I can't speak for anybody in this room. There may be those of you in this room who, for this is all very easy, and it comes easy to you. It's very hard for me. I remember things when they're done to me. And it hurts. Our whole justice system runs contrary to this command. Really. I mean, we punish, don't we? There must be something in this text which is not obvious. And I think there is something in this text that's not obvious. I hope that when we close down today, it will be obvious to us. I hope. Paul writes here, and you have to wonder, does Paul in this moment remember Stephen? I have to think, does he remember seeing this innocent man stoned to death right in front of him while he held everybody's cloak? Does he remember, as we talked about on Wednesday night, does he remember seeing children standing in the doorways of the Christian homes whose parents he drug off to prison or to death? Does he remember that when he writes this? I wonder. There are lots of things in here that are very common and human. For instance, common sorrow. When Gloria, or when someone dies, common sorrow is an easily shared sentiment. It's easy for us. We do it very, very well. We're all sad that so-and-so has died, or that so-and-so is sick, or that your business law, whatever it is, we find that easy. But do we rejoice with other people when they rejoice? I'd say that one's a whole bunch harder. Now, all of us in this room have been children, obviously, right? Unless you were spawned by a spore. I mean, I don't know. So, as children, how many of you were at a birthday party? And the birthday party where your parents, obviously, had gone out and bought a gift to bring to the birthday child. But you were a child, and you saw the person get the gift that you would like to have for yourself. Right? So how much rejoicing did I do when I saw the new bicycle or the new whatever it was? It's not so easy. And we think that, we're grown-ups now. Well, maybe. Maybe we are. I'm going to say common rejoicing is a whole lot harder than common sorrow. And Paul is going to dig. This is a knife that's being twisted now. It's not just Paul and God using Paul to do a little clean surgery with anesthesia. He's going to dig very, very deep into who we really are here. This is the place where things are going to be uncovered. And the question for us is, are we willing to receive it? I'm going to say that when common rejoicing is part of our experience, it's only there because God has killed something within us. And that is that common sense of resentment that we have when somebody else does good and we don't. How many people have sat in a church service and somebody come forward for healing and they got healed? Well, you're thinking, who is going to be honest with themselves before the Lord today and say, but what about me? What about me? You see, this text, this is one of those texts we read just like a freight train. It's like reading a novel, and we read right through it. And just like in Sunday school class, we do not internalize these things in the way that God would have them internalized. Because if we do internalize them, they're going to hurt. They're just going to hurt. What if the success of somebody else requires us to lose something? Do we rejoice then? Maybe not. Maybe not. What if there's somebody out there who they've come to a place of more wholeness than we have, and we want to be whole too? Do we resent that? I'm not going to answer that question for anybody. To live in harmony, as Paul says in verse 16, seems so common, but part B of that very text where he says, don't be proud, be willing to associate people of low position. Now, we don't hear that text in the way these people here would have heard that text. We do not. We think we do. We think, well, maybe if a black person came in our church, we would love them. Or a person who smells of alcohol, we would love them. That's how we hear it. That's baby food compared to the way Paul was speaking here. In this time in which Paul writes this text, this is how it was. You had in the congregations slaves. Now, the slavery such as we think of it in the 19th century in our country is not what Paul is talking about here. For these people at this time, slavery was completely uncontroversial, and it was just part of the socioeconomic layering of people. Nobody thought anything ill of a slave. For instance, let me give you an example here. Let's bring it home. A person, and I'm not saying this because this is the way I see things socioeconomically. I'm saying this because it's the way it is. Nobody in this country can actually live on the minimum wage. They cannot. Most of the people earning it are living in their homes, like my son lives in our home earning minimum wage. He can't live on it. I don't expect him to. That is the same as the slave class in the first century. They could not live on what they made. They were beholden to whoever was paying them just for what they got, which was food, clothing, and shelter. Now, when Paul writes this, there were several ways you could become a slave. Number one, you were conquered. Well, this is Pax Romana. It's been a peaceful Rome for 40 years. There might be a few of them around. Most of them have died, the slaves that were conquered in Rome, in the empire at this time. Most of the slaves were of two types. One, you fell on hard times and you sold yourself to a wealthy person and said, look, I'll work for you, and if you'll take care of my debts. And so you were enslaved. The Jewish system had a set period of time for that. The Romans did not. They didn't care. And so, but the other was you actually chose it as a life because you could not do anything else. You were born. In other words, let's say that the Snow family, that my parents had been slaves to some slave owner at this time in history, and I was born into that family. The slave owner had an obligation to take care of the children of the slaves on the condition that they were slaves too. Nobody thought anything about this at all. It was completely uncontroversial. We look at it from our ethos of minimum wage conversations and we feel it's just terrible. How can God endorse slavery? He's not endorsing slavery. This is just the times in which this was written down. This is how it was. Why is it important here? Because there were slaves in the congregation and their owners sat right there next to them. And Paul is saying, you got to let it go. There's no male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. All are one in Christ Jesus. Imagine you were a slave owner and you hear that about your slave. And we think, oh, well, that's not a problem for us today. Wrong. Wrong-o. It's still a problem. You know how I know that? Because I talk to the pastors. I have lunches. And I talk to the pastors where they will say, we've got a family in our church that is running the church. How do they do that? Well, they give a lot, or Their family left an endowment for the congregation. I know a pastor, I'm not going to say where, when, or in what time period, who was fired because a family in the church was mad about what was being taught and preached. Yeah. Do we have this problem today? Oh, yes, we have this problem today. People sitting in the pews who think they are somebody because of something they're doing. Paul says, you got to lose it. You got to lose it. All are one in Christ Jesus. Don't claim wisdom where we don't have it. Now, this is where, at this time in history, I look at this and I say, wow, how do we even go to the poll? I mean, if the ones who are running for office don't think themselves wiser about what this country needs, how do we even vote for them? Why would they run? Except they think they've got the answers, right? And we're going to vote for those who we think have the answers. Gosh, it's so wrong. It's so topsy-turvy, and Paul is trying to get this across to us. It's not a measurement standard that says how smart is somebody. It's a measurement standard that says how do they live? What are they like at home? Which is where all this is going to funnel down to. Then he talks about some of the most heartfelt of all these sentiments. He says, don't repay evil with evil. That's just impossible to do. It's just impossible. Now, in the big things, it's easy, right? In the big stuff, it's easy. World War II. What did we do? Did you know that Proverbs passage about heaping coals on their head, if your enemy's hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. That is United States military doctrine toward an enemy. Did you know that? That's what we do. You look back at Japan, bombed them to oblivion. But then we went in and rebuilt the country because we're going to heap those coals on their head. Not a bad thing, a good thing, so that they're drawn out in the goodness that lives within them. I'll tell you, if you and I look at this passage, and this touches so directly on the Sunday school today as it struck me, two things have to happen. One is the Spirit of God's got to live in you, in me, all of us. If He does not, we're not able to do this. I don't care how good we are. Secondly, we have to be intentional. We have to be. Now you might say, well, how do you do that? I'm going to say it's forethought, pure and simple. I remember when, and I can do this because he's not here, when Jackson was 3 years old, all of a sudden, it was my fault this was happening in our family. We would go to bed. Becky and I go to bed pretty early. We go to bed about 9 o'clock. We try to be asleep by 10 because we get up so early. Well, we would go to bed, 10 o'clock, here comes Jackson. Out of the bedroom, into our room. I've told this story 10 times, but I can't help it. It's one that's just burned into my mind, where I was laying in my bed, and he had been to the swamp park and had gotten one of those strings of plastic with a bunch of lights in it, you know? Yeah. And I'm asleep. And then he comes into our room, and he carried a blanket all the time at this age. And in the blanket is the string of lights. The blanket's lit up. And I you know how you wake up and you sense somebody in the room? And I open my eyes, and there's this glowing thing 6 inches from my face. I had no idea what I was looking at. You know, I thought, is this it? The mothership has come. They're going to take me away. So he was getting up. What are we going to do? Well, Becky'd been reading a book by John Rosemond on raising children. Thank the Lord for John Rosemond. We would have not survived. He said, do this. When he gets up, take him to the bedroom, hold his hand, walk him calmly, don't say anything, put him into bed, kiss him on the cheek, cover him up, walk out of the room. He said, but when you do this the first time, you're going to be doing it till about 3 o'clock in the morning. He was right. What made it work? We were purposed to do it before we ever got there. We went to bed with the idea we're going to just walk him into the room. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to do anything strange. We're not going to chastise him for being out of the bed. And 3 nights later, it never happened again. But that's what Paul is telling us this for. We have to be ready, because there are going to be things that can come in our lives, and it's always, always, always going to be from the people who are closest to us. Always. Somebody that you love or I love who's very close. I'm not thinking of anyone particular. Could be. Should we just say it like it is? A spouse is going to come into your life or mine at a moment when we least expect it, and they're going to say something that sticks the knife in and gives it a crank. And we're going to feel it, and we're not going to be ready for it. Paul is saying, you see this list? Think this way. Be ready for that. So that then there's something in us that responds in the way that says, as we talked about in Sunday school today, if we love God, we're going to keep His commandments. If we love God, we have to love each other. And we also have to live that way. Remember David and Saul? You remember David? Saul's chasing him. Poor David. He's just being chased all over by the king of Israel with an army yet. Saul comes to a portion in which he feels the urge. And I've often wondered about this when I read the Bible. You don't see this, but in just a place or two. What do you do when you got to go to the bathroom? When you're way out someplace? It's kind of like asking astronauts. That's the most common question for an astronaut. What do you do when you got to go to the bathroom? Well, I wonder about that for some of these biblical guys because you don't ever see it. But here's Saul. The king has to go into a cave to relieve himself, the text says. So while he does, I'm sure he had a guard. Hung his cloak outside. You know, cloaks kind of get in the way of that sort of thing. So you go in there and David comes off, cuts a piece of the cloak and then retreats to a distance. When Saul comes out, he says, see here, Saul, this is how close I was. I could have killed you, but I'm not going to kill the one chosen by the Lord. That's who you are. And Saul was brokenhearted to tears in front of his men because David had heaped the burning coals on Saul's head by doing good to the person who was his enemy. He says, as far as it depends on us, Paul says, do this. I'm just going to leave it here for us today. Who in this room is really ready to do this work in their own life? Now, I know we think we are, but I'm going to say that to the Lord, that you want to do this work, and He's going to find that spot. The spot that you just and I cannot let go of. How many of us are really willing to let it go? See, it's easy in the big, but when it comes to somebody in our family, don't we want to get that little snipe in there? They say something to us that hurts us. If we say it under our breath, or even if we just think it, it's there. It's there. I want to make them pay like they just took a piece of me. At the end of his life, W.C. Fields, most of us in this room, he's even before our time. I just know him from old black and white movies. But he was a person, if you go back and read the history of his life, he was a person who lived a very dissipated life. I mean, wine and women was his life. And that made him a fortune. I mean, he was a vaudevillian comedian and a comedian in movies because of who he was. It's like one of those personality kinds of characters that just is famous because they're such a whatever you want to call them. And W.C. Fields was, toward the end of his life, his friends came into a dressing room and found him reading a Bible. They said, what are you doing? What? I'm just looking for a loophole. Yeah. Guess what? If you and I are walking with Jesus, there are none. There are no loopholes. He asks of us what He asks. Scottish pastor George MacDonald, who, if you never heard of George MacDonald, that's all right. You've probably heard of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says of George MacDonald, he was the greatest influence for Jesus in C.S. Lewis's life. He wrote a bunch of things. I've read a lot of George MacDonald. Some of it is, he wrote fairy tales. He wrote long character studies where you just, if it were a movie, it'd be one of those where two people sit at a table and they just stare at each other and the wind blows a curtain off to the side and nobody says anything. One of those real artsy kind of movies where the whole movie's about who they are. That's the way he wrote. And then he wrote treatments, commentaries. I mean, prolific writer. He was never anybody but just a pastor of a small church in Scotland. He said this, of this text, he said, the dull world has gotten this wrong. It is the one who resents the affront who puts it in their pocket and carries it. It is the one who takes no note of it who lets it lie in the dirt. Now, I'm going to ask us a question today, and I ask this of myself as well. Are we willing? Are we willing? Do we care enough about growing closer to the Lord to allow this text to give us the opportunities? Are we willing to pray that God would bring us those moments where somebody close to us twists the knife, that we would learn how to not repay evil with evil, but to repay evil with good, to bless somebody who has cursed us? I'm going to say this, it's beyond any human capacity. The Spirit of God can make us able if we're intentional about it. The question, those questions are satisfied, aren't they? The real question is, do we want to be able? If you say yes, God will meet you where you are, but I promise you this, it won't come without a cost. But do we want it? Do we want it? I don't know where everybody